The International Monetary Fund has always positioned itself as the lender of last resort for African countries. In fact, many African countries facing economic turmoil always seek loans from the IMF. But at the same time, IMF loans comes with very strict conditions. And before giving any country, any government, any loan, these conditions, the countries and the governments must commit to meet these conditions. One of the beneficiaries of the International Monetary Fund loans is Ghana, which is currently bankrupt. Kenya, my country, is another beneficiary of IMF loans. And Kenya, over the years, since the new administration started governing the country, Kenya has sought, I want to say, a number of loans from the IMF and World Bank. And these loans, as I have just said, comes with very strict conditions. Every country, every government seeking loans from the IMF must first commit to meet the conditions. In my country, Kenya, one of the conditions that the IMF gave them while giving them loans was an increase in taxes. Now, I know most Kenyans will not understand why the taxes have increased. I want to inform my fellow countrymen that the taxes that are currently imposed on them are from the IMF. The taxes that are currently facing them are recommendations from the IMF. Kenya is under the grip of the IMF, and they must dance to the tunes of the IMF. They must dance to the tunes of the IMF, and they must implement every decision that the IMF makes. One of the recommendations of IMF, one of the conditions of the IMF to Kenyan government was for them to implement strict tax measures. And these strict tax measures exposed Kenyans to very hard livelihoods. Currently, I have friends who are employed by the government, and I have friends who are working in the private sector. Those who are employed by the government and those working in the private sector are both complaining of the high taxation rates. Those who are self-employed, I want to say they can boast because they are not exposed to the many taxes that the government imposes on employees. Why am I talking about Kenya? I am talking about Kenya because Kenya is in the line of being bankrupt. You remember just last week, if not this week, Ghana declared bankruptcy. And this declaration by Ghana, I think, started in some 2 years ago, I want to say so. Sometime in 2022. Or let me say 2020. Because Ghana's economic performance has been declining over the years. In some part, we might blame the COVID-19 pandemic, which affected almost all global countries. Ghana was one of the countries that was affected by the COVID-19 pandemic seriously. Now, Ghana is currently bankrupt, and Ghana's bankruptcy comes with huge loans which it owes to the IMF. Now, just a snapshot. Before interest, the back payments that Ghana owes to the IMF add up to about 1.3 billion US dollars, which is about 15 billion Ghana cedis. And I read an article which was saying that the Ghanaian government owes teacher trainees 2 months of back pay, and independent power producers are owed 1.58 billion US dollars. Ghana declared bankruptcy when the national debt in relation to her gross domestic product, GDP, for the year 2023 stood at 98.7%, and this percentage was 88.7% in 2022 and 79.6% that was recorded in 2021. Now, it is reported that in Ghana the government owes around 63.3 billion US dollars at the end of 2022, not just to foreign creditors but also to homegrown lenders, including pension funds, insurance companies, and local banks. Now, Ghana is bankrupt. That is a fact that we cannot contradict. And I see the next in line is my country Kenya. Why am I saying that my country Kenya is next in line in declaring bankruptcy? Despite the heavy taxation on Kenyans, despite the heavy taxation on citizens, the Kenyan government continues to complain of harsh economic times. In fact, the current administration took a very long time to admit that the poor economic performance in the country was due to the Russia-Ukraine war. It took a very long time for them to admit that. But currently, since they are in power, they have admitted that the current poor economic performance in the country results from the Russia-Ukraine war. That aside, Kenya's national debt in relation to gross domestic product as of December 2022 stood at 67.3%. That was from a previous of 67.7% in 2021. Now, just a comparison, Ghana declared bankruptcy when the national debt in relation to gross domestic product GDP for 2023 was 98.7%. That is 98.7%, and Kenya currently has a figure of 67.3, which in 2023 it was estimated at 69%. That is 69.0. Now, Kenya, my country Kenya, is just 29.7% shy from the situation in Ghana. Only 29.7%, let me say just 29%, shy from state of bankruptcy. I think when a country, the national debt versus the gross domestic product reaches around 80%, then a country is able to declare bankruptcy. Kenya is in the road of declaring bankruptcy, and if the tough economic times in the country are not effectively managed, then the Kenyan government, Kenya as a country, and the Kenyan people will, let me say, will be exposed to very tough economic times. Kenyans need to know that the government is not calling the shots in the country. The government is a spectator. The one calling the shots in the country is the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. The IMF is the lender of last resort in Kenya, and the IMF constructs policies, tax policies, and every regulations that manages, that, let me say, controls the sourcing of funds in the country. Kenya is currently under the grip of IMF, and every economist will support me in saying that any country, any African country that is under the grip of IMF is at a very great risk. If a country reaches a point where the IMF calls the shots, then such a country is at a very great risk. Such a country will impose policies based on the recommendations, based on the provisions of the IMF. Kenya is one of those countries. Kenya owes IMF billions. Kenya owes IMF millions, and Kenya imposes taxes, makes tax decisions based on the recommendations of the IMF. Kenyans must be ready to face very harsh economic times ahead, and Kenyans must prepare for a possible bankruptcy in the government.